Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello and welcome to episode 56 of The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. For this early January episode, we are focusing on the fruit of the sea, fruit de la mer. My accent is terrible. Winter is a great time of year to eat shellfish and seafood in general, so we're going to check in on the oyster variety that everyone seems to be buzzing about lately, and then talk about how the organic farming movement may have taken to the seas. Finally, we will dig our claws into an interesting new development in the climate change fight that is being led by the crabbing industry. Now, let's meet our guests. Cynthia Nims is the author of 9 cookbooks and has collaborated on many more. She's also a culinary instructor and has been the past president of the International Association of Culinary Professionals, as well as the Seattle chapter of Les Dames d'Escoffier. Welcome, Cynthia.
Great to be here, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
And Kerry Newberry is a food and wine journalist for numerous magazines, including Wine and Spirits, Sunset, Sip Northwest, and Edible Portland. Hi, Kerry.
Morning. Good to be here.
And Diane Morgan is the award-winning author of 18 cookbooks and a culinary instructor. So good to have you back, Diane.
Well, thanks, Catherine.
Now let's dig into our first course, the mighty Olympia oyster. I've been noticing lately that Olympia oysters have been getting a lot of press. I've been seeing articles about them, and I'm just curious. So fortunately, we have Cynthia Nims here, who is an oyster expert. So apparently, Olympia oysters were formerly endangered, but they seem to be making a comeback. Cynthia, you're the author of Oysters, Recipes That Bring Home a Taste of the Sea. So maybe you can start us off by telling us a little bit about what we need to know about Olympia oysters.
Sure. The Olympia oyster is such a beautiful sort of West Coast story because it's not only an amazingly delicious product that we should all be proud of having in our backyard, but it really has a story that's tied into history and development of the West Coast, ecology efforts, sort of, you know, everything from the gold rush to ecological efforts today. So it's really sort of a vast topic that we could spend the whole show on, but we won't. So the Olympia oyster is the only oyster that is truly native to our West Coast waters. It's a small oyster. It is, even when it's 3 or 4 years old, it's barely 2 inches long, where Pacific oysters, at that age would be 6 inches or larger. I mean, they really grow a lot faster. So the Olympia is a small oyster. It's got a very distinct flavor. It's quite different from Pacific oysters that have become more prominent in our area. And it's one that has just a beautiful Northwest legacy. The reason it started to sort of decline in populations was, as I mentioned earlier, sort of that tie to our history and the development of the West Coast with the gold rush and mining operations around the San Francisco Bay, where Olympia oysters had been wildly prominent. They had been proliferate, very, very available in that bay, but mining operations sort of compromised the waters of the San Francisco Bay, and even literally just sort of muddied the bay, so it buried even the ground that oysters would grow in. So even as early as the mid to late 1800s, those oysters started to have trouble surviving. And up here meaning I was thinking me up in Washington State, Willapa Bay was a prominent bay with a lot of Olympias, and up there it was paper milling operations, logging industry that was decimating that waterway that, again, had been really full of Olympia oysters. So they really took a big dive in the early 20th century into the mid 20th century. And then, of course, like a lot of our food efforts, we rallied, the community rallied, native populations rallied to try to replenish the Olympia oyster. And the thing about oysters in general, not just Olympias, is that they are a hallmark species of the region. They're also considered something of like a keystone species. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but it's a species that has an sort of a disproportionately large impact on the ecosystem in which it lives. So an effort to preserve Olympia oysters and make them sort of rebound is also helping our ecological environment in general, because a healthy oyster bed is going to be a healthy environment for eelgrass, for crab, for countless other species that rely on the clean waters that are made clean by bountiful oysters. So it's a beautiful sort of it's a literal synergy, an ecological synergy. Healthier oyster beds mean a healthier ecosystem that provides a healthy environment for countless other populations. So special efforts are being put into Olympias because of this connection they have to our history, to our local, foods. It's, like I said, truly the regional local oyster we should all be proud of.
And getting back to what you were talking about regarding sustainability, don't oysters, I think I read, Cynthia, that they're a filter feeder. Creature?
Yeah, they're a filter feeder.
So they
absolutely.
actually clean the water?
They
is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly what they do, and that's that impact they have on the ecosystem. They gain their nutrients. They feed themselves by filtering countless gallons of water through their gills every day. They open their shells a little bit and they filter water through and collect nutrients. And in doing so, they're literally cleaning the water. So the water is clearer, and that creates a healthy environment. There's more light that gets through that water and gets to other species that rely on the light, like eelgrass and populations that live lower in the water. And so the clarity has a big impact on their environment. So it's kind of a funny thing. They're not doing it to clean the water. They're doing it to feed themselves. But the benefit we get is that cleaner water provides a really healthy ecosystem. And it's kind of an interesting thing. Again, oysters end up being kind of a poster child for a healthy environment. A lot of the sustainability and efforts, and like in Washington State, there's a Washington Shellfish Initiative, which sounds like, the government's trying to make sure we just have half-shell oysters to eat, which isn't exactly the reason they're doing it. The reason is that a healthy shellfish environment is going to mean that so many other things about the ecosystem where shellfish are grown is healthy, clean waters. There's less effluent coming off from, human interactions and agriculture and stuff. So it's really thinking about the broader ecosystem. It just happens that the delicious oyster is a tangible representation of a healthy environment.
That's so interesting. Well, you said the keyword delicious. Hey, Kerry Newberry, I know you're an oyster aficionado. So can you describe the flavor of Olympia oysters?
I think one of the things that I often hear when people talk about them is that they have a very distinct coppery taste. Is coppery good?
I
think people can either love it or maybe not so much.
Right.
But people who are also, another thing that draws people to them is, again, that tininess. And so they're kind of, they're nice and firm and crisp and really have also that kind of briny splash, I guess.
They pack a punch. It's a small oyster with a big punch.
I will say I'm probably the only human being in the Northwest who's not a huge fan of raw oysters. So I do love those tiny ones because it's not like a big blob of cold.
So appetizing, Catherine.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. To each his own, or her own, of course.
I'm embarrassed to admit that.
That's okay. So there's really, I think it's pretty exciting. This time for Olympia oysters. And I just want to be sure folks who are listening don't feel like, oh my gosh, it sounds like I shouldn't be eating Olympias because they're endangered or, there's ecological concerns about them. It's kind of the opposite of that. The more people actually consume a product, Olympia oysters in this case, the more it's going to encourage and enforce better practices, more. I mean, it's already great practices. The people that are growing Olympias are doing everything they can to create this healthy environment, but it'll encourage even more of that and an expansion of more beds that are growing Olympias, which means, again, like more clean water. It's all like a win-win-win. When more consumers are interested in these oysters, it's going to make more sense, more economical sense for the farmers to grow them. They do take longer to grow, and they're small and they're finicky, so they're expensive for growers. There's more work that goes into an Olympia than into a Pacific. So, but the growing demand for the Olympics means that there's going to, it's going to make more business sense. So there's kind of two parallel paths, which is, again, really great and very win-win. There's a whole ecological path, which is really just about reestablishing beds where Olympias were native and flourishing 150 years ago. And that's just an ecological track. Those aren't oysters for you and I. Well, not you, apparently, Catherine, because you don't want them, but Diane
I
and Kerry.
like the small ones. I like the small ones.
So there's the ecological track that is all about the healthy the ecosystem and not our enjoyment. But then at the same time, there's a track of more growers investing time and energy in their oyster bed space to Olympia's. So it's, that's two things going in a very positive direction at the same time.
Well, one thing I was fascinated by was reading about the Wild Oyster Project around the San Francisco Bay, where this nonprofit collects shells from restaurants and returns them to the bay. And is that the Olympia's? Explain to me how this works.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's one among a handful of, or at least a handful that I know of, efforts along the West Coast. The idea is that oysters. So without getting too sort of deep in the science, when oysters spawn, they create these minuscule little larvae that are floating around in the water, and they need somewhere to land or they're not going to survive. They have to land on something that's viable where they can grow their shell and build, and basically grow and become a thriving oyster in a couple of years. But without something to land on that is suitable for their environment, they will perish. And they look for something like an oyster shell. I mean, traditionally in the wild, they're going to find an old oyster shell on the beach and grab onto that and grow. So without those oyster shells in the bay, it's just a losing prospect, kind of. So they're planting, basically. Not planting, but adding oyster shells to the bay so that these native spawn of Olympia oysters will have somewhere to land and thrive. And that's true for Pacifics too. I mean, all oysters will glom on to some older oyster shell, preferably, and that's where they're going to grow best. And up in, again, where I am, in the Seattle area, the Puget Sound Restoration Fund is a really amazing nonprofit that focuses on a whole lot of different restoration efforts across the spectrum of sea life. But one very specific effort that they're working on is, in fact, restoration of Olympia oyster beds. And they are doing similar projects. They'll determine if a bed that could be healthier. What do they need? Do they need maybe just more oyster shells for the existing spawn to grow on, or do they need actually maybe more spat little baby oysters actually repopulated there, so then they'll, over the course of a couple generations, naturally begin to repopulate. So they identify what the needs are for these different bed spaces around the Puget Sound and do what they can to help those oysters naturally repopulate where they were abundant again, ages ago. They have a particular goal right now of repopulating up to 100 new acres of oyster bed space by 2020. And I recently spoke with Betsy Peabody, who is the executive director and founder of the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. And she said they've gotten 65 acres of those 100 reestablished so far, which is really cool. And it's really exciting to see these efforts really flourish and really sort of taking root. And then at some point, hopefully those new populations will just naturally regenerate and they can go on to focus on other areas and other oyster beds that need more attention.
I love feel-good stories like that.
I know, isn't that awesome? So don't feel bad. Go out and do feel good, actually, about ordering and trying an Olympia oyster. You'll be encouraging further efforts to...
And then drop your shells in the water.
Yeah.
It's kind of like composting.
Yeah.
Well, Diane, are you an oyster fan?
I am an oyster fan. I have just learned a ton about oysters that I didn't know, and I'm like, wow. It's sort of, Cynthia did this deep dive. Kerry's done tons of articles and research, and it's just fun to sit with experts and hear about the behind the scenes of what you eat. And really get a bigger picture, because it's always complicated. And it's almost always, food is emotional, and this makes it, you get the science, you get the history, and you get the ecology of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like our theme today with this show is kind of tying together those big picture sustainability issues with just the joy of eating things we really love. Does anyone have any recommendations for wine pairings or mignonettes for the Olympia oyster? Anyone want to jump in?
One of the things about Olympias is because they have that super, super distinct flavor that's not really like many other oysters. I am just kind of a purist. And I think it's, aside from maybe a little squeeze of lemon or something that kind of brightens the flavor, not that they need that brightness even, I tend to want to enjoy them as they are because they're so special and so unique. And I wouldn't want to lose it under too much vinegar or, kind of cocktail sauce. That's my personal perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think after meeting with a lot of different oyster farmers, I kind of adhere to the purist ethic as well, but I do like a splash of lemon. Mm-hmm. I did want to mention, I was recently, I think as far as 18 cookbooks, Diane, you would appreciate this. I was in Eventide recently in Portland, Maine, and they had some really funky crushed ice flavors that they served with the oysters, and one was kimchi. And they had horseradish, pickled red onion, and Tabasco, but the kimchi I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, that really...
And Eventide's an oyster bar, right? I feel like I've been there. Yeah,
I am really jealous that you got to go there because it's on my list. It came up like every single time I was researching it. Almost anything, Eventide would come up because they were just one of the top oyster bars in the country. That's, oysters are just such a fun topic right now. I mean, you can go to almost any city in the country and it seems like there's oyster bars and people are really gaining a deep appreciation. And I don't feel like it's a trend thing. I think it's really just sort of a new lifestyle way of eating thing that's not going to be going away. And so I think that's super encouraging because, again, all those people eating oysters encourages more healthy environment in which they're going to grow. And it's just eat more oysters, everybody. That's just the bottom line.
Well, I love that message. And it sounds like it's much more sustainable to eat oysters than, what do you call just regular fish? Non-shellfish. These days, we keep hearing all these stories about how our fish population is falling and we need to do something. And then fish farming isn't necessarily solving the problem. But there has been talk lately about organic fish farms. We all know about organic farming on dry ground, but it's hard to kind of wrap one's mind around what an organic fish farm would be. So Diane Morgan, you have visited and written about salmon farms that at least follow best practices. I don't know if they are, you can't be certified organic at this point as a fish farm, can you?
Not in the U.S.
So can you tell us about what makes a sustainable fish farm?
Well, you have to go over to the North Atlantic. That's where Europe created organic certification for seafood and salmon in particular. And part of that came because there was no commercial enterprise for wild salmon. That was wiped out in the late 60s, early 70s. And so they had to do something, and they created fish farms for all these communities of fishermen that were no longer had any viable way of making money. And so then they went on to develop certified organic practices. But really what that means is that the feed that the salmon are getting, the nutrients, is organic feed. And so beyond that, they are being farmed in open waters in net pens, and whether they're a small farm where they're hand-fed or whether it's a large operation where they're mechanically fed, is, it still means if they're certified organic that it's the feed.
Okay, now let me back you up. What is a net pen? What does it look like?
Okay, so a net pen, picture, when you have a net that you catch a fish, and then you're reeling it in and you put it into a net. Okay, and if you expand that a gazillion-fold, then there are these nets in the water that contain these salmon that are being grown for harvesting, and there's these platforms that people can walk out on to maintain and service the fish that are in those huge nets. And so farm salmon is all about these huge nets that contain the fish. And that's the good thing, that they're contained. The bad thing is the concentration of fecal matter that falls to the ocean floor. And so the best practices is those net pens are moved. And when I was at this farm, in this organic fish farm off of Ullapool, Scotland, they had an area so they were able to move net pens. And that I was seeing best practices. But I could also, as we were driving around Scotland, you could also see from high points these net pens that's where they were, that's where they were steering, that's where they were staying. And over time, you have this accumulation on the seafloor of just, of excess feed, fecal matter, whatever, and it's contaminants. Mm-hmm. And so the farming industry varies completely as to, best practices versus just grow the fish and get them out of there and grow some more.
And you could be certified organic in Europe, even though you weren't moving your net pen around and you were sort of polluting.
Yeah, although those tend to not be one and the same. So, with any kind of fish farming industry, the hope is that you just keep getting better and better as you grow the practices. And what's newer in that industry from when I wrote my first book is that there are, and they're doing this in British Columbia, and actually there's a fish farm off of Seattle, and it's an above ground tank that filters water from the waters into the tank where they're growing the fish, and then it cleans that water and sends it back out. And that is it's expensive, but that's the newest trend in the industry for farming.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
So there's some in British Columbia, and it's so much better because you're not, the risk of net pens breaking, which they do, is just it's just devastating when it happens to the industry. And there was a net pen that broke in British Columbia. And, you have these Atlantic salmon swimming in Pacific waters. Oh. And so you just have this risk of genetically changing the wild populations.
Oh, wow.
And so that's why I'm watching for this industry with these above ground tanks to be more economically viable.
That is so interesting. And can I back you up about one more point? You said, so an organic fish farm, the fish consume organic food. But I've also read that fish farming, one of its consequences is that there's this whole other fishing industry that is harvesting the fish that the bigger fish eat. So
right. It's little fish
Mm-hmm.
being ground up to feed bigger fish.
And is this what the salmon eat?
Sometimes. Now there's a company that started growing feed that was plant-based. And they have fish farms down in Chile. And so that was another trend that you were seeing, it's almost like taking high omega-3 fats and putting them into fish feed to feed the fish that are high in omega-3s.
This all sounds so complicated.
It is complicated, and it was like, okay, so, but yes, there are plant-based feeds that are in the farming marketplace.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Sure.
Do you know how does that impact the flavor or the actual flesh of the fish if it's eating a plant-based diet as opposed to its natural?
It's really interesting. A few years ago, I did and it's not the first time, but I had done a blind tasting of farm versus wild salmon, and it's less the flavor than the texture of the fish that I can tell because a farmed piece of salmon is flabbier.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about, they're in these net pens, they're not doing the wild
working.
behavior
Right.
of,
Sure. And but if they're eating the plant-based diet versus, so do you know if the plant-based diet impacts like flavor or texture, like that new Chilean test, or do you have an idea?
It seems a little bit oilier.
Oh, okay. I was just curious. It's interesting because I would think it would have some change in the fish. We'll see.
Yeah, but it's subtle. I think you would have had to have eaten a lot of salmon to know that difference. And when they're growing the salmon on fish farms, they're growing typically the Atlantic species. And so on the Pacific, are you eating sockeye? Are you eating Chinook? Are you eating silver? And each of those have a flavor profile. So it's different. But
So why don't they farm the Pacific species?
they are not as viable as the Atlantic. Like that's where all the practices started, and so that's what they learned to farm, and so that's just it's kind of how the industry grew.
Yeah, I was wondering that too, Diane. Are there other fish species that are more conducive to being farmed than just the Atlantic salmon they're finding?
You're jogging me to think about whether they were trying to grow silver salmon. And I think there have been attempts at it, but I think it's the fine-tuning of raising the Atlantic salmon that has just worked the best.
And it seems there's been a shift. I was just reading about it in the perception of farmed fish, because I feel like for so long it was always perceived as, don't eat farmed fish. And now you're hearing more and more people kind of speak to the positive effects
Well, because practices have gotten better.
Okay.
But I think the labeling is still, if you see organic salmon on a menu, which you will see, and they'll specify a farm. Like they might, there's fish farms in New Zealand and Australia, and they'll be labeled, but they'll say organic, and people are attracted to that because, I want to eat organic fish. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you think about what out of Alaska wild salmon are, they're essentially organic.
They're as organic as they
They're
get.
organic as they get. And so, and in the same way, my ears perked up when Cynthia was talking about, you were helping the industry to eat Olympia oysters. You are helping the industry by eating wild salmon, because that the more there's a demand for it, the more the more these fishermen have, and all the production, all the producers down the road, and processors, they have jobs, and so there's just you are supporting those industries, and the seasons fluctuate. This year was not a huge run in Alaska. But that's hopefully just cyclical and not a result of climate change. I think everyone's kind of, has bated breath on, is this cycle just cyclical or is this a trend line? And so, but if you were in the market this year, you saw that king salmon was $40 a pound. It's really dear. And I always stock my freezer with 50 pounds of flash frozen salmon. And I typically buy, say, 40% of that is Chinook and 60% is sockeye. And this year I bought all sockeye. And I did it through a CSA that's the fisherman's based in Portland, but he fishes in the Kenai.
Oh.
And I'm typically buying Copper River. And this year the fisherman that I was going to buy from, he used to process fillets, and now he only does headed and gutted whole fish, and that's harder for me to utilize as a consumer than having a flash frozen, vacuum sealed 1.5 pound fillet of salmon. And so it was really interesting this year because I was like, I'm going to economically need to switch what I'm buying because just affordability.
So maybe in the future, I hope that our wild population. So you're saying that the more demand there is for the wild salmon, the more there will be. I mean, that sort of defies.
Well, in the same way as if you maintain the demand for wild salmon, then it supports the industry.
Yeah.
Now, if there are summers like this past one where the run just was not as vibrant as other years, then you have to accept that. Mm-hmm. But the point I'm making is hopefully that's cyclical and not a result of warming waters. And I think it's just too early to tell. If next year and the year after are all smaller runs, then it's worrisome. Mm-hmm. But if you have these years where it's just a smaller run, and in Alaska, fishermen can't go out unless enough salmon have gone upstream to spawn because they count all those and they make sure that they maintain sustainable stocks. you then you accept that there's a smaller amount of fish being caught. And you accept that for the year, but hopefully that's not an every year situation.
Well, this is bringing up something we'll be discussing. Actually, let's just transition to our next topic, which is these fishing industries really rely on a healthy environment and a clean ocean and on climate. A climate that's not going to change as much as it seems to be changing. So it's interesting to consider the idea of the fishermen having a say in the climate change debate. And we've been noticing just recently there have been some articles about some fishermen some actually crabbers who are suing oil giants because their industry has been so negatively impacted by climate change. As we were preparing for this episode, the news broke that associations of crab fishermen in Oregon and California had filed suit against some of the world's biggest oil companies, including Chevron and ExxonMobil, claiming that climate change caused by the oil industry had devastated their own industry. I just found this to be so interesting and definitely tied to everything else we're discussing today. But before we kind of launch into this, Kerry, Newberry, you have written about what it's like to go out on a commercial crabbing boat. So I thought maybe you could start by just explaining to us what is Dungeness crabbing? How do you practice this art of or this? Not really an art. It's an industry. How does Dungeness crabbing work?
Well, I had 3 words to segue into with the fishermen I've talked to. It's when you think of Dungeness crabbing, it's cold, competitive, and cutthroat. The season is short and it's very competitive. And one of the reasons why is that in Oregon, Dungeness crab is often the most valuable single species fishery in the state. So it's high stakes for those fishermen. It's also a derby style fishery, which means when the season opens, all the boats head out, just no matter what the weather is. And you try to catch as much as you can in a short amount of time as you can. And the season has a set time frame. So usually the season opens in December in Oregon. I don't think it's opened yet. I feel like there's been a delay. But usually it is December, so there's a kind of restless energy in places like Newport, which is the Dungeness crab capital of the world, I believe. It's affectionately called that. But as far as what it's like for a fisherman, some of the folks I've talked to who are mostly based out of Newport say it's probably one of the most dangerous fisheries in the world. And one gentleman, Corey Feldner, was saying that they like to call it the deadliest catch up in Alaska, but he says it's definitely more dangerous in Oregon. And one of those main reasons is the weather. And then in addition to that, down in Newport, when the boats are trying to cross the Yaquina Bay Harbor, it's the shallowest area before heading out to sea. So when you're on a 45-foot wooden vessel, you don't want to be, you're susceptible to big waves and giant storms as you're trying to get out past that area. And that waterfall is really powerful, and it can basically just break your boat or...
Yeah, I mean, people die every year.
Yep. And so I think it's a reminder to me, I guess, whenever I eat Oregon Dungeness crab to really kind of relish and savor it, because I think of those fishermen who are out there risking their lives every year in a very, very short turnaround time. I think one of the statistics I'd read said that, the first couple days that they head out, about 75% of the annual catch is landed. So although the season for Oregon Dungeness crab runs, I think, from December to May, maybe, most of the commercial fishermen are catching that initial crab up front, like within those first couple days. And they've said that, again, this gentleman who I spoke with, fisherman, was saying that first week of crabbing, when the boats head out, they often are going on back-to-back trips, and they basically just return to unload their crab and sleep for a few hours. So they're up at 5 a.m., and then they're back at 11 p.m. at night, and then they just head out that next morning.
And so they're harvesting, they're fishing in the coldest months of the year. So I'm assuming that this industry really relies on cold waters, cold temperatures, which is why climate change is. Cynthia, what?
Oh, well, no, I just think it's like it all comes down to that we need to keep the climate in check, I think, for all these reasons. I had the good fortune of having my crab cookbook come out like literally a day or two after news hit about a domoic acid problem in California, which was affecting crab. I'm like, oh, good timing, Cynthia. But it's, I guess, all of these things that come up, they give us all rich opportunities to educate people about the food that they love, why it's like you're saying, Kerry, to appreciate the fishermen that caught the fish or the crab in this case, and to appreciate, that our climate's good because I was able to eat this oyster. And I think every time I hate to say it, but bad news gives us an opportunity to educate and inform and hopefully encourage people to think about their lifestyles and choices they make that are going to help the overall, benefit that we can get from a collective effort to keep our environment safe and, just bountiful for these seafoods. But yeah, I think the domoic acid outbreak is, again, related to heat, to the waters being a little bit warmer. So certain algae, I think it was an algae, flourish that are toxic to the crab. And so it is sort of that domino thing. And hoping there won't be domoic acid outbreaks this year. I don't know. I haven't heard of any lately, but I haven't been paying attention.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was what was holding up the start of the December season. I think they'd found traces of it. Or
Yeah, Kerry, I thought I'd heard this story that there wasn't enough meat on the crab yet.
Oh, okay.
And that they were waiting for them to plump up.
To fill out, yeah. That's kind of the key indicator that the fisheries agencies look at is proportion of meat to shell, because it's right after they have they're not spawning because they're not oysters. Right after they have shed their shells, what's that called?
Molting.
Molted. Thank you, Diane. Shifting gears, different seafood. Yeah, so after they molt, they have to fill out their shells and get their new hard shell full of meat. So that might. I mean, I hadn't, like I said, I haven't read lately.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it's not. Fingers crossed, it's not domoic acid this year.
Well, Kerry, I just love that picture you're painting of, it just sounds like such a heroic profession. These people are so brave. They're going out, they're risking their lives. They aren't sleeping to catch these just beautiful, who doesn't love Dungeness crab? It's just, I can't think of anything more delicious. And then there's this whole David versus Goliath story with these crabbers, banding together and suing the EPA, or not the EPA. Actually, in October, the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations successfully sued the EPA to protect salmon and steelhead populations in the Columbia River. And I love that these, hardworking, heroic fishermen are doing something and making some change. And, maybe this lawsuit, who knows if it'll be successful or not, but it'll certainly bring attention to the issue.
Right. Yeah, and I think sort of ties into that, too, is I feel there are, at least in Oregon, there's the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, and it's basically built up of fishermen, and it's because they want to make this industry last as long as possible. They want it to be there for, the next generation that wants to go into fishing. And so they actually are even putting their own restrictions on what they catch every year. And it's something that it's like they're self-regulating their own, what they're making each year in order to ensure that there is that, there's sustainability to their business.
It's so interesting, Diane. We were talking before about how in Europe there is such a thing as organic certification for fish farming. I feel like in the U.S. we don't go the regulatory route. We don't go the top-down route. Things just kind of grow organically, and fishermen band together, like you're saying, Kerry. And we do have a litigious society here in the U.S., and sometimes we get things done by suing and from the bottom up and fighting. Like I just love this story of these fishermen who are just fighting to keep their industry alive. And although it would be nice if we maybe had a little more regulation as they do in Europe.
Well, it's different regulation. Alaska is hugely regulated for their seafood industry because it's such a huge part of their their revenue. And so in that same way as the Dungeness crab, the salmon industry is highly monitored and regulated, and fishermen don't go out if there aren't enough salmon going upstream to spawn. And that's the whole season. That's how it goes. It's like they have what are called openers, and fishermen are allowed out when there's enough salmon that have gone upstream and that they can go out and catch, and then that opener is closed and they wait for more salmon to go upstream, and that goes on all summer. And so the sockeye come in first, and then the Chinook, the kings, and then later the silvers and the chums. And so it's that way, and it's all regulated, and it's for the good of the industry as a whole. And there's a salmon commission off the Oregon coast, and they're doing similar practices. They're not just trying to get everything, because it's the same thing. There's no fishing for future generations.
It's so interesting that this is. I mean, all the other sources for our food are basically farms on land that are, this is just, the whole fishing industry is just so sort of it's almost like the Wild West still. It's almost still like the frontier. Mm-hmm. I think about, the disappearance of the buffalo, and we're kind of there with seafood, aren't we? Where we need to make steps now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. It's I'm thrilled about these preserves in the oceans that they've set aside to maintain wild stocks, and these other plastics in the ocean are huge. And there was a sperm whale that was caught, and I forget how many tons of plastic was in.
Oh, I read about that.
I saw that too.
Was in the gut of this sperm whale, and it's just shocking. And so, like, all these little things that we can do that just stops the plastics that we all use daily and don't think about. Straws is the beginning of it.
Yeah, I think when I eat seafood, that's one of the first things I think about too, is plastic, and how many different ways I use plastic, and how is that going to change? I don't know. That's going to have to shift at some point. I don't know if it's going to be what the plastic is made of, or something that actually does decompose, or.
Well, it's interesting. I did this little switch that seemed, if I buy a baguette, and it's just my husband and I, we certainly are not eating a whole baguette. And so I wrap it. I keep it in the paper sleeve, and I wrap it in plastic wrap to keep it somewhat fresh so I can reheat it the next day. Okay. So I went online to buy these baguette-length plastic bags that I've had. I couldn't find any. And so I'm like, well, what am I going to do? And I found, and I think I was on Amazon, and I'm doing a search, and they make this beeswax wrap, and it was baguette length. And so I ordered it, and that's here great. Is this. Now my baguette goes straight, without the paper, goes straight into this beeswax wrap that clings to itself, and you can just rinse it off and dry it, and I hang it up like a tea towel to dry, and I reuse it, and it's brilliant. And I'm like, okay, I made that little difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And in our next episode, we will be discussing bees.
Yeah. Wow, right.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time to move on to our dessert course, in which we each just end things on a positive note by discussing something that made us happy this week that's food or beverage related. And I will quickly go first and say that in addition to being a food journalist, Kerry Newberry is a photographer. And I stumbled across this photograph from the Oregon State University collection. It won the 2006 Jurors Purchase Award. Everyone needs to Google this photo because it is so beautiful. It's so striking. I love it. And it's also a little risque.
Yes.
I will pass it around. I
can't wait.
Everyone just Google Oregon State University, Kerry Newberry, 2006 Jurors Purchase Award. It is, I'm passing it around now, Kerry, maybe you can tell us what it is.
Very old, but yeah, from many years ago. In a lot of old wine cultures, there's a historic way to kind of not, stomp on your grapes, but it's pigeage, and some people do it au naturel.
That is without clothing.
That is so funny. That is so old.
But it's a beautiful photo.
Yeah. Art About Agriculture is a really cool program, too. It's an annual event, and there's always amazing works that they have represented, and they showcase it throughout the state for about a year.
So it's just for those who are listening, it's a beautiful woman's back, and she is not wearing any clothing. And maybe you don't want to tell me who that is, or do you?
Secret.
And she's stomping. She's just standing in a vat of grapes and stomping the grapes. But it's just beautiful composed. It's a beautiful photo. So
and it is an Oregon winery.
And that's all you'll tell us.
That's all I'll say. Yeah.
Well, I love it. So, Diane, did you bring a dessert item today?
I'm on post-Thanksgiving glow. While I chose not to cook anything poultry this week, Thanksgiving's my favorite holiday of the year, so I am just getting over all of the Thanksgiving foods that I, spend more than I probably spend 2 weeks planning and executing and making lists and whatnot. So I'm about to throw out my little orange and white pumpkins and gourds that are gracing my table and about to get out holiday Christmas decor. And so it's like a little bit of a letdown, even though this is supposed to be dessert, but it's, my cranberry blueberry pie is like as a memory as opposed to a good memory.
That sounds so good. How about you, Cynthia?
Well, I just recently finished. I'm a big Audible person. I listen to books all the time. Not while I'm working, obviously, but anyway, I love listening to books. And there's a really cool project. It's available on Audible now called Twain's Feast. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's a book based on Mark Twain's sort of favorite dishes that he wrote about after a trip to Europe, or while he was on a trip to Europe in the 1870s. He was having all this bad hotel food and was really yearning to be home. And, when you're yearning to be home, you think about the foods that you miss and what you can't wait to eat the moment you get home. So he wrote about that and had this very long list of all these American foods he was going to relish, and actually sent someone a letter and said, have these 85 things ready for me when I get home because I can't wait. So this book is based on that idea, and the author who wrote a book about that letter and that food list is called Andy Beers, I believe, and then with Nick Offerman, the actor, they worked together in this very, very engaging, very interesting book that has a chapter based on some of those different foods that Twain relished that are, some of them no longer available, and they recreated to the best of, sort of modern ability, actually in one of Twain's former homes in Connecticut. So it's a really super engaging. It's about history. It's about Mark Twain. It's about foods that, like these kind of sustainability issues we're talking about. Why is the prairie chicken no longer around? And I got to say, I love Chapter 4 because it's about his time in San Francisco and oysters. Oh. So be sure and listen carefully to Chapter 4. But Twain's Feast is a super great listen.
Oh, I love that. I'm really into audiobooks too, so I'll definitely check it out. Thank you. Kerry, did you bring a dessert item?
I did. I have 2 that relate to oysters, since I was revisiting Cynthia's book, and I was looking up other old oyster writings, and I came across there's a great website/blog, and she also has a great Instagram account. It's called In a Half Shell.
She's the best.
Isn't she amazing?
Yeah.
So I just got her oyster holiday guide. And it's full of oyster gifts and party ideas and recipes. It's Julie
Key.
Yeah. Okay.
I believe that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah. And I think she's based out of Brooklyn. She also does oyster city guides and oyster tours.
She's all about oysters.
She's all about oysters.
She's the best.
So that is a great thing. And then I was getting nostalgic for somebody I think we both, John Rowley, the late great John Rowley.
John.
And many years ago, I went on what is called the Walrus and Carpenter Picnic, and I was wondering if they're still doing them, and it's hosted at Taylor Shellfish Farms, and they are. And so what it is, it's a nighttime low-tide picnic that is lit by lanterns and moonlight, and it's on one of the oyster beds that Taylor Shellfish owns. And you basically take a bus from Seattle. I feel like it's an hour and a half or 2 hours or something, but you're entertained the whole way. Somebody recites the whole Walrus and Carpenter tale by heart.
Exactly.
Lewis Carroll.
Yeah.
And then you basically go out onto these oyster beds, and there's tables of people shucking oysters, and they've paired them with oyster wines, and it's an amazing evening. So anyways, they are still doing it, and there are 2 dates set in January and February. So if you just Google Walrus and Carpenter Picnics, you can eat oysters at their source in one of the most magical settings you could ever imagine.
That sounds amazing.
It's amazing.
It is one of a kind. Pure Northwest. Yeah.
Yes, totally.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, special thank you to all you panelists. Kerry Newberry, I love that you have written an article entitled Oysters, a Love Story. If people want to look up your work, where can they find you online? What's your website?
Oh, kerrynewberry.com.
Well, thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And Cynthia Nims, you've written books on salmon, crab, and oysters, so very lucky to have you here today. And how can people find you online?
Same, kind of pretty easy. CynthiaNims.com will get you there.
And Diane Morgan, author of 2 books on salmon. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Do you want to share your website?
Sure. DianeMorganCooks.com.
Oh, Diane Morgan Cooks.
Nice.
There we go. Okay. Well, hey, listeners, we love feedback, so please visit our website at theforetop.org, and you can find links to all of our social media handles so you can get in touch with us and continue the conversation. Today's episode was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in the studios of OPB. Alex Ward is our editor. Izzy Kramer is our assistant producer. Special thanks to sound supervisor Stephen Cray and the web staff at OPB, who bring our show to life on the OPB website. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer Kermit Lynch. You can listen to our 55 back episodes on your favorite podcast app, and that includes Spotify, iTunes, NPR One, and Stitcher. Or you can go to our new dedicated website at theforetop.org, and you can listen to back episodes and also donate to our show. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit blanche.